There are about 50 million victims of human trafficking in the world currently today. However, this does not account for the large portion of victims who go underreported in this topic of human trafficking. So, how prevalent is it? Human trafficking can happen to anyone at any time, in any place. The most common forms of human trafficking are familial trafficking, which is the trafficking of a person by their own family member. So this interactive chart will show us a couple of statistics of prevalency within different people. So in the US today, the number of human trafficking victims worldwide from 2004 to 2020 is shown here as women having the highest statistic, 74% of women and 42% in 2020, with 13 men in 2004, with 23 men in 2020, 10 girls in 2004, 18 girls in 2020, and 3% boys in 2004 and 17% in 2020. So this is just a big map of what these statistics look like today, with women obviously coming up as being very high percentages. However, girls are trafficked at a very young age as well. Men and boys also tend to be trafficked. However, it's less unheard of, but it does happen. And there's a large stigmatism behind being trafficked as a male, but it is something that still deserves awareness too. I want to go over here a survival story. This is Fainess Lepenga. She was a survivor of labor trafficking. She came from a dysfunctional family life of poverty. She was born in Malawi, so she came from a family in Malawi, and she was then approached by a trafficker and promised that she would make money, that she would be able to send it back to her family, that she would get a house, a home, and all the necessary needs. Her needs were going to be met. However, she was manipulated and she was physically abused, financially abused, paid less than 40 cents an hour for her work in a house, and she was never given that money back. And she eventually escaped. She found her passport. The people who trafficked her also hid away her passport, but she found her passport and she ran away from that house. And she luckily found help and is now a survivor of labor trafficking. So here's a couple of news articles, news headlines that had been very popular within the past month of just people in regular places, in hospitals, schools. A case where a 15-year-old student was trafficked at her school by a teacher. Human trafficking process. So the process of victimization in human trafficking is very important because it includes it includes the trafficker taking control of their victim physically, emotionally, um, financially, sexually, as well as imposing a lot of threats and fear of threats. And so there are many ways that someone can be lured into trafficking. False promises and of money, of love and acceptance is something that is very common. So here's a quick video on grooming. It is a technique that traffickers use in order to lure victims.
Ask you to come on the podcast today to kind of help us understand and help our audience to understand what do we mean by that term grooming, and what does that look like? What does it entail? What does that mean?
Yeah. So I love that you mentioned like there are so many different ways that trafficking can happen.
Yeah.
And it never happens the same way twice. But even in all of these different forms, whether it's gang controlled trafficking, familial trafficking, even labor trafficking, international trafficking, hip controlled trafficking, grooming in some way, shape, or form is almost always part of that process. Because what grooming is it's essentially preparing someone to be abused.
Yeah.
It's conditioning them to do something that is not in their nature, which is to accept abuse and accept exploitation as their destiny or as their reality, and not fight back. That's not in human nature. It has to be cultivated.
So there are many types of human trafficking. There's child abduction, forced labor, organ theft. There's a lot of ways where someone could be exploited. So here is another interactive chart where it shows forms of exploitation. And in these forms of exploitation, it ranges from being sexually exploited to removing of organs. So we can see here that for sexual trafficking, North America is actually pretty high. It's for 73%, in there with Central Asia as well. Trafficking for forced labor, the percentages kind of flip, instead you see here North America is at 21%, and here instead of Eastern Europe was below, it was at 9. And for labor trafficking, it's all of a sudden gone way up for 87. So here are other purposes as well. So this could be like child marriages and things like that. Trafficking for removal of organs, something that's it's less common, but it is definitely not not a real thing that happens. And here is for exploitative begging and sexual exploitation once again. So there are negative family dynamics in a person's life can lead them to being trafficked. They can end up, and this is also very common for children. Children who are not given proper family support and who are not cared for can end up looking for other ways to be accepted, other ways to be loved, and for other people's attention. And that is a vulnerability that traffickers look for, and they can um, identify that vulnerability and begin to groom that person into thinking that they are the person that they need to trust, that they are the person that's going to take care of them. So a lot of this also has to do with prior victimization. If someone was sexually abused or physically abused or emotionally abused, all of those things, if they were abused before, it is likely that that is the perception of the way that a relationship to be to them. That is what they believe to be as a normal relationship, which can make them more vulnerable to somebody who is already um, has a plan to take advantage of those vulnerabilities. So here we have the power and control wheel. This is a very interesting and really helpful diagram of what human trafficking is about. And generally, it is about power and control. Human traffickers use many things, many types of abuse in order to maintain the control of their victims, who they have lured in by things like false promises and financial gain. And here we have another interactive chart about means of control. So this is a chart that will explain or will give an idea of what kinds of means of control traffickers use. So this is 2000 from 2002 to 2019. These were the leading means of control experienced by sex trafficking victims. So victims who were sex trafficked, about 32% of them were physically abused, or 33% had threats. 4% had threats of law enforcement. Sexual abuse would be 22%. Psychoactive substances. So that's very common for someone who is being sexually trafficked to be under the influence in order to make it for their trafficker, it makes their traffickers have an easier time controlling their victim when they are under the influence. In this chart, we have victims from 2006 to 2019 who experienced labor trafficking and the leading means of control while they were being trafficked. So here we can see that taking earnings is a lot higher, it's 35.4%. So a lot of the times in trafficking, victims are not allowed to keep the earnings that they make, and they are psychologically abused and manipulated into forever being in this debt that they have to repay. So involvement in law enforcement is also very important because it has to do with the way that law enforcement conducts their investigations. Sometimes it's not possible to catch every human trafficker. It's not possible to close every single human trafficking ring because of the breach of privacy that sometimes is needed in order to infiltrate these rings. And another thing that's really important to understand is that it's important to be trauma informed as a law enforcement official. So being trauma informed means having knowledge of victims and having knowledge of what kinds of trauma that a victim may have been exposed to that may make the process of investigation, of convicting their perpetrators, of prosecuting the perpetrators, that may make it difficult for a victim to disclose certain information for fear, for lack of support, for for being traumatized of their experiences. So as a law enforcement official, it's important to take note of this and to really understand the best approach to helping a victim without making them feel re-victimized by the system, which is kind of our next bullet point here, which would be kind of this process of a victim having to relive their their traumatic experience by having to retestifying in court is also a very traumatic experience for most victims, and it's important that law enforcement understands that. So this is a survivor story. This is Jose Alfaro. This is, he was 15 when he ran away from his abusive household. He was being physically abused and psychologically abused by his family. And he was also a member of the LGBTQ plus community, and he was not accepted in his family, which is the reason why he ran away in the first place. He ran away seeking this love and acceptance that he was not getting from his family, and he found it in the form of a 39-year-old man on a online platform. And this 39-year-old man took care of him. He gave him a place to sleep. He gave him food. He gave him all the necessities he needed in exchange for sexual services. So at the time, Jose did not know what a relationship was. He did not understand that this was not a healthy relationship. This was not something that was normal. And so when he realized that, he ran away again. And luckily, this time he was found by somebody who took care of him and did not demand exploitation from him. He was given the opportunity to go to school, and he is now an advocate for other victims of human trafficking. Lastly, I'd just like to mention that there are a lot of advocacy and nonprofit organizations that work to help victims through this process of human trafficking and help them get out of being trafficked, as well as helping them heal afterward. Elijah Rising, Hands of Justice, and Polaris are just three of many organizations that have helped many victims become free from their traffickers and have gotten back on their feet and gotten control of their lives again.